We know that the subject of food, of dietary habits, is an essential component of every case assessment and interventional plan through the functional medicine lens. We always consider the powerful positive effects of a targeted, nutrient-rich diet, how the appropriate food selection can contribute critical macronutrient and micronutrient profiles for a given patient. We don't, however, always consider the full spectrum of negative effects that foods might be having in each unique case. In particular, how everyday foods might be driving inflammation. And in this case, I'm not talking about the highly refined, toxic, chemical-rich foods that is such a part of the standard American diet. Behind the scenes, regular intake of widely agreed healthy foods can actually be a dramatic mediator of inflammation and dysfunction in your patients and clients. And I am talking about food sensitivities. That's the topic of this episode of Functional Medicine for Real World Impact. Today, I'm going to be covering 8 common myths and their complementary truths on the topic of food sensitivities. This is essential information for all medical and wellness practitioners, and I invite you to share this clinical insight so that your colleagues can benefit too. Welcome to Functional Medicine for Real World Impact, where we're diving into the complex, interconnected nature of health and disease, exploring not just theory, but practically what it takes to turn functional medicine insight into powerful, practical, real-world results. So please hit subscribe and let's get started. The first myth is perhaps the most obvious one, and this is the notion that food sensitivities don't exist. At best, their prevalence is exaggerated, and perhaps at worst, only a non-credible or quack practitioner would focus on food sensitivities and their role in disease. But leading medical researchers have well demonstrated, especially over the past 10 or so years, that food sensitivities are real. And as I said, they often play a dramatic role in promoting or mediating disease in individuals who wrestle with chronic dysfunction. Food sensitivities, or more accurately labeled immunologically, type 3 delayed hypersensitivities can develop completely separate from what we more typically refer to as allergy. Even conventional immunology honors allergies. Of course, these are mediated by IgE antibodies and present with all sorts of negative or even life-threatening downstream dynamics, mediated by different inflammatory biochemicals, especially histamine, that leads to itchiness and hives and swelling of mucosa, perhaps even trouble breathing or anaphylaxis. But completely separate from classical allergy and IgE antibodies, the human immune system can have a reaction in particular to foods via the development of IgG and IgA antibodies. IgG being the most prevalent antibody in our systemic body, especially in blood. IgA being the most prevalent antibody providing mucosal interface defense, critical for protecting these entryways into the human body. So being able to measure or assess and honor IgG and IgA mediated food sensitivities can be an essential and often overlooked component of helping your patients to uncover the common root causes of their disease and what they need to do in order to promote the reversal of their chronic disease. Even going beyond these types of hypersensitivities, let's talk for a moment about even the wider lens of negative reactions to foods or ways in which healthy foods might be part of disease exacerbation, because we know that there can be T cell mediated hypersensitivities to foods that don't manifest with any antibody response. For that matter, going beyond immunological response, people can have intolerances such as lactose intolerance or fructose intolerance. They can also have overloads in their unique diet for substances that their unique body does not handle well, such as FODMAPs if they have IBS, or lectins if they have arthritis or chronic joint pain. Perhaps an overload of oxalates in a unique individual who wrestles with recurrent kidney stones or pain syndromes like vulvodynia. Perhaps phytates can be wreaking havoc on the intestinal mucosa. Maybe they don't well tolerate goitrogens or nightshades or other categories of phytonutrients in given foods. All of this to say that food is an essential component of our livelihood, of course, but we need to cast a keen eye to what is the optimal diet for this unique person and question carefully how might foods be actually mediating or actually causing chronic inflammation. Food sensitivity testing is a key consideration for many of your cases through the functional medicine lens. But it is essential to teach your patients up front that no food antibody test is 100% conclusive on foods that are good and safe for them to eat and foods that might be promoting disease. Just because a food doesn't show up as having a notable level of antibody response doesn't mean that there aren't other pathways or other intolerances or other overloads that might be at play. We encourage all practitioners to get educated and become truly savvy at it. First of all, at assessing the diet and then identifying what might be at play for a unique individual. But this leads me, of course, to myth number 2, that food antibody testing is the end-all be-all of dietary recommendations. And as I said, there is no single lab test that measures all immune pathways. And then some negative responses to foods are not even measurable with typical qualitative testing. But IgG and IgA testing are now, thankfully, commonly available. But we need to teach our patients and clients in advance about how to use these tests most effectively. First of all, IgG testing is now common. Your patients can go online, find places to order their own food sensitivity testing. Many times they arrive in your practice having already assessed their food sensitivities, and they are convinced that this long list of foods is a major driver for their disease. Unfortunately, they're also often overwhelmed about what to do with such a big list. Here are some nuances you want to consider with regard to IgG antibody testing. First of all, IgG antibodies are not just about driving inflammation in response to potential threats. This antibody is also produced in the process of developing immune tolerance. In fact, one of the reasons why an individual might have elevated levels of IgG to a given food is because they are undergoing immunotherapy to help to counter and reduce an allergic response to that same food. This is why total IgG testing can be really quite vulnerable to false positives. It tends to give long, ponderous lists of sensitivities that can be quite intimidating to practitioner and patient alike. And thus, not all of the findings in this total IgG test panel are going to have clinical relevance. We make this testing much more valuable when we combine assessing IgG antibodies to looking for actual activation of the complement pathway. This means we're flagging high antibody levels for given foods only when they are coincident with actual evidence of inflammation. This makes IgG testing more likely to have reliable positive results. But keep in mind that foods that show negative for IgG antibodies may still be reacting down a different pathway. In particular, IgA, especially because so many chronic disease cases that we see in functional medicine practice involve the gut. And the old truism, disease begins in the gut, or disease begins in the colon, or that all health actually begins in the gut, is really quite true. And gut dysfunction can open up a pathway for the development of many food sensitivities. IgA antibodies in particular can become elevated in the intestinal lining in response to immune hypersensitivity there locally. Individuals might not show many or any IgG mediated sensitivities, but behind the scenes with a dysfunctional gut and loss of barrier function in the intestines can lead to IgA mediated sensitivities. So for your patients who have notable gut dysfunction or downstream pain syndromes or chronic inflammatory syndromes, autoimmune disease, some of these diagnoses that tend to begin in the gut or be notably mediated by the gut, consider doing IgA antibody testing in addition to IgG testing, or perhaps instead of, if there is a limited finances for supporting both forms. But the devil in the detail here around food sensitivity testing can make all the difference in the world for getting information that is reliable. There are many different companies out there that offer valid, credible food sensitivity testing. Companies like KBMO are assessing total IgG antibodies coincident with complement. Companies like Cyrex offer really wonderful, rich panels that can be ordered separately for IgG and IgA or perhaps combined. But looking at the nuance of the difference in immune system reactivity to cooked versus raw foods, perhaps a very helpful nuance to further eliminate false positive results. Other companies such as Genova Diagnostic and US Biotech offer good, rich IgG panels and also IgA panels to help get that closer look at the mucosal picture. Vibrant Wellness has a rich variety of focused, targeted, as well as broad survey types of food reactivity panels, including IgE, as well as IgG with complement and IgA. So you have many tools to choose from. They vary wildly in accessibility, in number of foods that are tested, and also in price. So it's important that we have a rich toolbox as a practitioner so that we can best match a unique patient's needs with an ideal type of testing. Now, myth number 3 is about going beyond IgG testing and remembering that IgA can be a critical mucosal signal. And I just want to add a little bit more nuance to that IgA is not just prevalent in the intestinal lining, it's also prevalent in other places in the body, such as the mouth, the lungs, the nasal respiratory membranes, the vaginal mucosa. These are all places where IgA is the predominant antibody. And so again, we want to be understanding where that may be at play with or without elevated IgG. But IgA is especially of note where you suspect there may be a loss of barrier function in the gut. And this leaky gut dynamic can actually be a key player in why people develop food sensitivity in the first place. After all, we would love for what happens in the gut to stay in the gut. In the process of digesting foods, we are breaking down foods to all sorts of progressively less and less immunogenic forms. But partially digested food showing up in the intestinal basement membrane, getting overexposure to our gut-associated lymphatic tissue can be a major driver for immune hypervigilance. And if we lose barrier function in the intestines, and then the systemic body is responding with inflammation to partially digested food, then this is, of course, going to likely develop high levels of both IgA and potentially IgG antibodies as well. What might surprise you is that individuals can have enhanced intestinal permeability without necessarily having notable GI symptoms. This surprises a lot of practitioners. In fact, many make the assumption you can't really have food sensitivities if you don't have any GI symptoms. But the reality is that immune-mediated food reactivity can manifest far beyond the gut, especially when we have that loss of barrier function in the intestines. Circulating immune complexes can lodge in joints, in particular, areas of low circulation, and create arthritis-like symptoms. When we have loss of epithelial function in the intestines, this can often manifest downstream as loss of barrier function in other key mucosa, things like the blood-brain barrier, activating the gut microbrain axis, which can be involved in a lot of pain syndromes, for example. We can end up with nasal respiratory and dermatologic types of signs like eczema or acne or hives or rosacea in response to what's actually happening in the gut. Some individuals experience postprandial fatigue or mood imbalances as a key symptom of food sensitivities. But for sure, there can be gut symptoms as well. Food sensitivities might be the major driver of symptoms like bloating, dysmotility, burping, GI pain, stool irregularities, acid reflux, things that we need to consider in our full investigation of symptomatic suffering in a unique patient. Now, going on, that's myth number 4, but going on to myth number 5, we want to talk for a moment about the common myth that food sensitivities are somewhat random, or that they are genetically hardwired. And both of these toward the goal of there's not too much you can do about them other than trying to reduce or avoid the food. But in truth, most food sensitivities are acquired. And in fact, they are often reversible responses to upstream dysfunction, especially, as I already mentioned, in response to loss of barrier function or enhanced intestinal permeability. That might be driven by things such as medications, whether it is oral estrogens, like in birth control pills, or non-steroidal anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen, antibiotics, chemotherapy, steroids, proton pump inhibitors, antidepressants. All of these are medications that might, in a unique individual, be directly contributing to mucosal degradation and the eventual development of excessive intestinal permeability. Toxins can also be promoting a terrain that enables loss of barrier function, or in the intestines in particular, simply promotes hypervigilance in our immune system. And this can be toxins coming from all sorts of foods, artificial sweeteners, artificial colors, artificial texturizing agents, emulsifiers, fragrance. It can also be pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, other endocrine disrupting chemicals and preservatives. All of these can excessively activate our dendritic cells with regard to hypervigilance, and might also increase the reactivity of mast cells and creating more histamine as well, completely separate from IgE antibodies. We can have microbial imbalances in the gut, dysbiosis, bacterial, fungal, parasitic, the chronic inflammation in response to countering these microbial overgrowths can create wear and tear in the mucosa of our intestines and promote immune hypervigilance, or again, eventually lead to loss of barrier function. We know through the groundbreaking work of pioneering researchers like Dr. Alessio Fasano and Doctors Aristo and Elroy Vojdani, that disease can begin in the gut via foods. Dr. Alessio Fasano has helped us to understand how gluten in vulnerable individuals might promote higher levels of endogenous protein called zonulin that naturally promotes loss of tight junctions in the intestinal lining that can promote enhanced permeability. And we've learned about cross-reactivity and indeed food-based molecular mimicry, whereby a hypervigilant immune system over time can cross over not only into chronic inflammation, but actual development of autoimmune dynamics. Doctors Vojdani very well acknowledged for their research and clinical work in food-based autoimmunities, for example. So we need to consider where foods may be a major mediator of disease. And I'll come back and talk more about gluten, some key nuances you need. So please stick with me until I get to myth 8. Myth number 6 is an important clinical consideration around timing. We wrestle with the myth that it doesn't really matter when you test for food sensitivities. Any convenient time works, but nothing could be further from the truth. Timing matters. Anytime that a patient or client is undergoing a current life circumstance or environment that might be suppressing or dysregulating their immune system, we can end up with false negatives or temporary positives. So we want to, the best of our ability, recommend food sensitivity testing when individuals are experiencing their true normal lifestyle. There are many things that can temporarily interfere with optimal representation of the immune system in these tests, especially chronic stress or a period of acute stress that can upregulate or downregulate or dysregulate immune function. Individuals might have recently taken antibiotics, or maybe have recently struggled with a bout of food poisoning or a notable dysbiosis that their immune system has been overwhelmed by, which might lead the immune system to being underreactive to other threats for a period of time. We recommend choosing, to the best of your ability, a normal window of time where temporary or passing circumstances that might dysregulate immune function or misrepresent their normal response to food. 4 to 6 weeks is on the other side of antibiotics. 2+ months on the other side of steroids or other immunosuppressant medications is warranted. If a person is chronically taking medications that suppress the immune system, it doesn't mean that you don't run these tests. It just means it is prudent to consider the effect of the drug in interpreting the results. If the immune system is suppressed, then seemingly mild or borderline responses may be of notable clinical significance in those circumstances. So consider timing. Give your patients specific guidance on ideal timing for their unique life to make sure they get test results that are as clinically useful as possible. Now, myth number 7 is about what do we do with food sensitivity test results? There's a widespread myth that based on the findings, you can just rotate in and out reactive foods for 2 or 3 weeks, and then you'll probably be fine. There is a belief that you only need to do this for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month, and then the immune system will probably tolerate them upon reintroduction. The reality is, if you want to help your patients to both get well and stay well, then both calming the immune system and reestablishing tolerance of a food, durable, sustainable tolerance, is going to require 2 key steps. First of all, actual elimination of the food, not just reduction, not just rotation, but actual elimination. And then secondly, investigating and finding the root causes of the immune hypervigilance and resolving that functional imbalance while you're also eliminating the food. Both of these are required for durable regression of food sensitivities. We usually recommend 4 months of elimination of a given food in order to maximize the likelihood of reintroducing a food and finding happily that it is now well tolerated and can be reestablished as a regular part of a person's diet. Antibody half-life is a key consideration in this duration. IgG antibodies, for example, have a typical half-life of about 21 days. This means you need 4 cycles of half-life to get the antibody level down during elimination to less than 10% of what it was previously. Clinically, we've seen over the many years we've been supporting practitioners to optimize their clinical work. 4 months of an intention to eliminate usually leads to about 3 months of legitimate elimination. Because let's face it, food elimination is hard. No one enjoys it. We want our diets to be easy and convenient and not something we have to worry about or focus on. And so there are often some fits and starts and missteps along the path to fully eliminating a food and finding alternative foods that can become a part of people's habits. So we recommend 4 months, hoping that with some ups and downs in the beginning, an individual will actually get 3 full months of elimination, which is 4 half cycles. This allows also an optimal amount of time, 3 months minimum, to address the root causes of this food-based immune hypersensitivity. This can involve such dynamics as addressing maldigestion, whether it's pancreatic insufficiency or poor gallbladder emptying or hypochlorhydria, low stomach acid. For a variety of reasons, you can learn to understand and master all of those drivers. Or, as I said, perhaps loss of barrier function in the gut. But again, what's causing that? Is there a dysbiosis? Is there a medication culprit? Is gluten part of the problem? Perhaps chronic stress is a major mediator of immune hypervigilance. We have to investigate the mental, emotional, the physiological root causes of that. And 3 months is a nice, generous window of time to do that investigation and to begin to guide a patient on making some palpable progress, maybe not full resolution, but some palpable progress in resolving the drivers of the terrain that promotes the hypersensitivity, while we're also eliminating the food to ensure the immune system is progressively calming. The myth is that we don't need to take actions that are that palpable. But the truth is that in order for someone to have confidence that their results will be sustainable, we need to do both, and it needs to be for an extended period of time. Now let's close here with myth number 8. This is a critical component of healing for not all, but a lot of your patients struggling with immune hypersensitivity to foods, and especially where it's manifesting downstream with chronic inflammation and notably autoimmune disease. This is because gluten, and in particular gliadin, a component of the gluten protein, in vulnerable individuals can promote higher secretion of zonulin, which, as I shared earlier, is an endogenous protein that helps to regulate intestinal tight junctions. And when a spike of zonulin is repeatedly surging in the intestinal barrier in response to gluten, this over time can create enhanced intestinal permeability, which promotes chronic inflammation and also promotes a worsening of immune hypersensitivity and dysregulation that can lead to more inflammation, more food sensitivities, and autoimmune dynamics that can eventually promote disease. And so a key nuance here is that gluten can upregulate zonulin in susceptible individuals without necessarily triggering any antibodies whatsoever. So a person can show negative for IgG, IgA, for that matter, IgE antibodies, and they don't have celiac disease, right? But yet behind the scenes, zonulin is being upregulated. And this is where intestinal barrier function testing can be quite valuable. Some food sensitivity tests include an optional or embedded gut barrier testing. KBMO, for example, includes this, where you can see levels of antibodies to zonulin, antibodies to occludin, which is another protein involved in keeping tight junctions in the intestinal lining, or even antibodies to lipopolysaccharides, both IgG and IgA. And if they are elevated, then this is a good indication, especially if multiple markers are elevated, that enhanced intestinal permeability is at play. And in those scenarios, we teach and recommend full elimination of gluten alongside with other foods that are flagged in these tests, because removing the gluten may be absolutely essential for reestablishing barrier function and eliminating the terrain that is promoting these immune hypersensitivities. But the key clinical nuance here is that it's going to be hard to convince your client that gluten is a problem once they're excitedly holding a food sensitivity test result that shows no findings for gluten. You want to educate, inspire, and empower people about what to expect and how you're going to respond to the test data before that data shows up, so they're prepared for understanding where removing gluten may be clinically essential, even when the test result is negative. So these are 8 critical myths and perhaps unexpected truths that you want to consider with regard to food sensitivities, an absolutely viable and surprisingly common component of chronic disease presentation. Food is a critical element of every functional interventional plan for all of its positive nutrients, not only macronutrients feeding our metabolism, but also micronutrients fueling our biochemistry. But food can be part of the problem. It can be a key mediator of disease, not just when it's highly processed and toxin loaded, but when our immune system has lost tolerance to an also essential component of our environment, which is food, nourishment. And this is where the devil is in the detail around helping your patients to understand where targeted elimination and reintroduction, still the gold standard of immunology, is a key component of their healing path. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you like what you've heard today and want to learn more clinical tips through the functional medicine lens, please hit subscribe and share this opportunity with your colleagues. I look forward to being with you next time. Have a great day.